Greetings. I hope the first 3 days of classes have gone well for you. Welcome back to History and Culture. It was a pleasure meeting all of you in person on Monday, and now, of course, we'll have our second day of class virtually via an online lecture and a discussion to follow. Just so you know, I will upload this lecture immediately after recording it. I'm recording it shortly after the class that met today. And I will also be posting a online discussion in which I'm going to ask you to talk about some discussion questions that I will mention at the end of this lecture. The discussion questions will just be for the Monday group, and will sort of make up for the fact that we didn't have discussion in class today, and that will be the general routine that I'm thinking about for right now. I also hope that this lecture is clear enough. I'm recording it from my office on campus, hoping that this allows me to avoid some of the uploading problems that I had earlier this week. And I apologize if my office is a little bit messy and if there's a bit of a glare in my face because of the window in front of me. It's a nice day in Boone. So, first of all, just a few quick reminders. I hope you're all safe. I hope you're all doing your daily health checks. And most importantly, please remember to always feel free to reach out to me with questions if you have them. I am also always more than happy to either talk with you on the phone or to set up a Zoom meeting as office hours. Anytime you request those, I will do my best to grant those as quickly as possible. And also our tentative plan, and I discussed this with the Wednesday group a little while ago, is that Friday's class will be asynchronous online for everyone. I will, at the appropriate time, send out a lecture and a discussion assignment connected to it, and I will indicate at that time the time frame in which I expect you to complete it. So it'll be around Friday that you're expected to do it, but it won't be set for a specific time. So, with that said, I'd like to actually begin today's class. I enjoyed hearing your thoughts about the various meanings of culture on Monday. Now I would like us to begin to see if we can get greater clarity about the meaning of that term, culture, by talking about Raymond Williams' essay, Culture, which I asked you to read for today. And by the way, if you have not read that yet, I would strongly encourage you to stop the video and go and read it. It won't take too long before listening to this, because I will be speaking directly to it. And again, I want to remind you that the basic idea here is to try to reflect on what the term culture means so that we have some clarity or some understanding of that term as we proceed with the course, which is, of course, devoted to the history of culture and also culture as a means or a lens for understanding the past. So, with that said, I'd like to have you I'd like to talk to you then about the Raymond Williams reading and some questions that relate to it. And I will proceed through my lecture course. So, sorry, I'm going to start right here. Sorry that took a moment to figure out. So, I guess the first thing that I would like you to think about is the fact that the term culture has a kind of hidden but still important connection to the picture that you are looking at right here. Take a moment to look at it. I think that most of you will fairly clearly be able to identify this as a piece of agricultural equipment, specifically a kind of plow. If you think for a moment about what a plow is a tool, a piece of technology that's intended to assist with the task of farming. What a plow does is help you plow a field, plow the land. In other words, what a plow does is it, through various ways, cuts into the land, cuts into the earth, the dirt, so as to raise up soil that is underground and to be able to sort of rotate it, and also to create furrows into which seeds can be planted. What, you might ask, does this have to do with culture? This, of course, is a question that Raymond Williams asks. Think about it for a moment. What is the connection between a plow, as shown here, and culture? Well, the key thing to understand, Williams tells us, is that the very term culture itself, at its origin, at its foundation, when it first entered human language centuries and centuries ago, was a term for farming. And I think the question that Williams helps us to think about is, how do we get from culture as a term for farming to culture as a term to refer to all of those things that you talked about on Monday's class, as a way of life, as a kind of identity, as a form of development, and so on. That's what I'd like us to try and explain today. One thing that's worth noting is that if you look at the picture, and I can't really point to it, I believe, with this technology that I'm using, but you'll see that sort of in the center of the plow, there is pointing downward a knife-like object with a sort of clear, sharp edge on the right, and that is an element of a plow that I believe is designed to sort of make the kind of initial cut, if you will, into the ground, that is specifically called a coulter. Often spelled C-O-U-L-T-E-R. And that word is what linguists call a cognate of culture. A cognate means a word that is part of the same family and that sort of shares the same origin. A word that's, culture is, you might say, from a linguistic perspective, kind of a second cousin of the word culture. So I think it's interesting that even in the sort of basic plow, you have a part of the plow that has a linguistic connection to the term culture itself. So that's just my way of introducing this. Now let's see if we can talk a little bit about what Williams tells us about the term culture and its origins and its history and what we can learn from that. So we discussed all this before. I always think it's useful, or I think it's often useful, when you read an author to understand a little bit who they are. So the picture that you're seeing here is of Raymond Williams. Who is Raymond Williams? He lived from the years 1911 to 1988, so he was a 20th century figure. He was British, and specifically, he came from the minority nation in Great Britain. You might know that Britain is made up of several nations, they call it, the English, the Irish, the Scots, and the Welsh. And he came from Wales, so making him Welsh, but he's still a British citizen. And he was an academic. Put very simply, Williams' main job was that of what we would call an English professor, someone who studied the English language and English literature. He also was very politically engaged. That's not going to concern us too much, but it is worth knowing. He was particularly associated with the radical left-wing political ideology known as Marxism. basically meaning he's critical of capitalism and is a kind of champion of the industrial working classes. You might know that Wales, by the way, is a major mining country. It has a lot of interesting connections to the Appalachian region, which is also a mining area. So he was very interested in miners, and actually, if I'm not mistaken, came from a family of miners. And his academic interests were really about what I would call the connections between literature and culture and social change. And this is very relevant to this class. Williams, in other words, was interested in the way that by examining literature, by examining novels, poetry, fiction, we can learn something about the very real and concrete change that is going on in those societies. Are they agricultural societies in which most people are poor peasants dominated by wealthy landlords? Or, on the contrary, are they societies in which much of the population is engaged in factory labor run by capitalist entrepreneurs? Williams believed that we can learn a lot about a society and social change by examining the literature and thus the cultural works that it produces. So he also then wrote a book that is called Keywords, and this passage that I gave you comes from that book. And what Williams' goal is in that book is to examine, I would say, roughly 100, 150 words that he thinks are crucial to understanding modern society, to examine their histories and how they've evolved, and thus to say something about modern society by its sort of key words, by its key vocabulary. And it's in that context that he studies culture and makes that claim that we talked about, that culture is one of the 2 or 3 most complex words in the English language, which we see right here, or complicated words in the English language. So let's then talk about his essay. And I would just say that, a general theme, I'm going to go back here, a general approach to reading these kinds of texts is to think about what is the author's main point, what is the author's big takeaway. Over and above all the little details, all the specific things they say, what is the author trying to tell you? Let me tell you what I think he's trying to tell you. And it relates in a way back to the point that I was making earlier about the plow. How so? Well, I would say that the main point that Williams makes in this brief essay on the history of the word culture goes something like this. Once upon a time, culture was simply a word for farming. If you think about it, the term agriculture still has that word in there. Culture literally meant to cultivate, which in its most original meaning meant to plow the soil and to till and harvest what it produces. So agriculture literally means the culture of fields. So the original literal meaning of the term culture is quite simply farming. Okay? And we can see the traces of this in several contemporary words, including the ones that I mentioned, such as coulter, cultor, which are basically just words for plow or plowshare or part of a plow. Okay? What happened, and I would say this is the big event, if you will, the big turning point in the history of the word culture, is that concrete literal word started to be used in a metaphorical way. In other words, people used the literal meaning of farming or cultivating to talk about other things than farming or cultivating themselves. To give you a really kind of dumb example, I am someone who has a reputation for going off on tangents, and some people will describe going off on tangents as going down a rabbit hole. Okay, You say you're going down a rabbit hole because it sort of, you're on a main path, there's a hole, you go down the hole and get lost in that sort of complicated underground tunnel. I'm guessing, never been actually down a rabbit hole, but so it's a way of sort of saying that you've kind of deviated from the past in a way that might sort of make you lost and have a difficult time getting back to the sort of main road. But obviously, when I say I'm going down a rabbit hole, I have to be clear that I'm not talking about an actual rabbit hole. I'm using the term rabbit hole to talk about a tangent or deviating from a main topic. That's what I mean by a metaphorical use. There's a literal rabbit hole, which is the actual thing the rabbit digs and lives in, and then there's a metaphorical rabbit hole, which is the way that one might use that term to describe going off subject, going off topic. And something similar happened with the word culture. The original meaning of plow, farming, cultivating, and tilling the land came to be a term that people started to use for education and intellectual and mental development. Okay? And the idea is that just as a piece of land might start out as wild and savage and having lots of trees on it and lots of brush, but that later it could be cleared, all the trees removed, and turned into farmland by plowing it, that could then become developed, you might even say sort of civilized. Just as you can talk about the shift, in other words, from kind of wild, savaged, uncultivated land to cultivated farmland, similarly, you can talk about a shift from the human mind as kind of being savage, unkempt, unproductive, to a mind that through, say, education, through, say, reading, through, say, conversation, through exposure to music, painting, and so on, becomes increasingly developed and civilized. So in other words, culture becomes a way of talking metaphorically of how one can develop the mind just as one can develop fields through farming. Thomas Hobbes, who was an important British philosopher in the 1600s and who was well known for having written a famous political text called Leviathan, once spoke of the culture of their minds. And at the time that Hobbes was using that term in the 1650s, he was basically using the term culture a little bit the way that I use rabbit holes, in the sense that when he says culture of their minds, most people would still hear in the word culture the idea of farming. So they would understand that Thomas Hobbes was saying something kind of like the farming of the mind or the cultivation of the mind. But in using the term in that way, we can already see how it's beginning to transition to its current modern meaning, which really refers almost exclusively to the idea of mental development and things that are associated with that. So the big issue here, and I hope I've belabored it a bit, but I hope it makes sense, is that Williams talks about the shift from culture as meaning literally farming to a metaphorical way of talking about the development of the human mind and things that are associated with the human mind. So the key thing to understand is that this picture right here sort of captures the original meaning of the term culture. And by the way, I will point out that certain terms in English still sort of use culture primarily as farming. I work a lot in French, and the French word culture can just as easily mean things having to do with sort of mental development and ways of life and so on, as it can mean to refer to the act of farming. Okay, you can talk about in French, and again, I work in French, so that's why I'm giving these examples. You could talk about la culture du maïs, which would mean the cultivation of corn. But you would use the same word culture as we are using in these other ways. So what Williams does next, and this is kind of what I want to focus on next, is to say once that transition occurred, once we move from the literal meaning of culture as farming to the metaphorical understanding of culture as having to do with the mind and development, in fact, that kind of metaphorical use, first of all, becomes, at least in English, primary. Okay, the metaphorical use starts to replace a lot of memories or a lot of recollections of the literal use. It would almost be kind of like, nope, this is again my dumb example, no one knew or experienced what a rabbit hole was anymore and came to think of a rabbit hole simply as a word for a tangent. That's not completely true. There's like I mentioned, there's some ways in which we still hear sort of echoes of the term farming and culture, but it sort of recedes into the background. But then the other thing that happens is once we use the term metaphorically, it starts to have several different but related meanings. So, and Williams will focus on three main meanings that emerge. And just to be absolutely clear, Williams is not saying one of these is right and the others are wrong. He is not saying that one is better and the others are worse. He is just saying that based on his kind of study of the meanings of the term, he's aware of the fact that these are the three main meanings that have emerged, at least in English, although he does acknowledge that this is quite true of other European languages as well. So let me talk about those meanings a bit. So the first one, I would say, is that culture becomes a term for referring to civilization. Culture, in many ways, is a synonym for civilization, and specifically the civilizing process. So here's how that works. And he argues or proves that this meaning sort of emerges in the 18th century, particularly in French and German. 18th century meaning 1700s. It's closely connected to the term civilization. And it basically refers to the process, I have this sort of silly picture here, it kind of refers to the evolutionary process if we understand evolution as something that happens not just to our physiognomy, our bodies, but also to our minds. And I would say, in a nutshell, culture kind of refers to the process of shifting from a state of savagery to a state of civilization. Okay, culture means no longer being a savage and being a civilized person. I would also add that you could say that there's a kind of social dimension to it as well, which is judgmental and, as we would say today, kind of classist, which basically sees uneducated people as uncultured, and people who are educated and exposed to literature, music, art, etc., as being cultured. So you could also say that in this context it almost means kind of like refined. And I would also say that you could talk about culture, culture in this case, according to Williams, sort of is a term that's used to refer to the human development process in its totality. Okay, so you could say perhaps that it refers to sort of an individual's shift from a state of kind of being an undisciplined, untrained, uneducated little baby to being a kind of grown-up, cultured person. But it also refers to the story that societies go through from a state of savagery, lack of development, lack of literacy, and so on, to a state in which people are literate, in which there is a great deal of literature, in which there's an education system, and so on. Okay, so culture in this case really just means the civilizing process. The next stage is really, I would say, the one that you are most familiar with. When we talked in class on Monday, I think most of the definitions that you provided have to do with this one. And this is culture as a way of referring to a distinct way of life. And maybe one of the main characteristics of this one is, whereas the first definition, you can talk about culture in the singular, because it says it's one process that everybody goes through, maybe at different rates and at a different rhythm, but everybody goes through it according to that view. Here, culture almost has to be plural, because there's not one culture, there's not one model or template of culture. There are necessarily many different cultures. And I'll just sort of mention that this term really starts to become important in Germany in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And it's a way, and it becomes interestingly closely connected to the idea of the nation and nationalism, because the belief is that each nation or each people has unique characteristics to it. It has values, it has beliefs, it has stories that it tells about itself, it has a language that is very distinct to it, and that things like literature or folk tales or music are ways of expressing that distinct identity of a particular people. Okay, that's why I have the example of the Eskimo there, because you could say that everything that we might associate with Eskimos, whether it's igloos or the particular way in which they fish and their attitude towards particular animals and so on, could be seen as an expression of Eskimo culture. I would also say that the idea of folk culture and maybe folk tales is very important here, because it's connected to the idea that there are stories, there are beliefs that are sort of distinct to a particular people. So the big difference between this use of the term and the first one is that this one implies multiplicity. In other words, there's necessarily lots of different cultures. And also, I think this one doesn't really judge people in terms of where they are on a kind of evolutionary process from sort of savagery to culture, but instead says that every people can be thought of as having its own distinct culture, no matter at what stage of that process they might be. And then finally, I would say there's a third definition of culture. I should say Williams says there's a third definition of culture that is what I would call intellectual and artistic activity. And in this context, culture comes to refer, I would say, to particularly difficult or challenging intellectual works. And again, there's a kind of judgmental quality to this term, sort of like with the first definition, in the sense that it basically says that if we go back to the second definition, that it may be that a particular people or nation or group has its ways of expressing itself, but according to this definition, some of these are more demanding, more serious, more refined than others. And the ones that are serious, demanding, and refined, according to this definition, are kind of quote-unquote better and true culture, as opposed to forms of expression that are not refined, difficult, and so on. There's a term that's sometimes used. It's not commonly used these days. You probably don't hear it too much, but people talk about high culture. And what that just means is culture that is considered to be particularly demanding and thus having quality. The really, really simple definition that I would give of high culture would be, people who sort of attach a lot of value to Shakespeare or classical music. That should be Shakespeare or classical music, not of. And I hesitate to say that because that almost sounds like I'm saying that I'm discrediting them, because I think probably not a lot of people would be very sympathetic towards this definition. I don't mean to do that. I just mean that, there are certain people who would say it's actually important that everybody read Shakespeare because there's something worthier about Shakespeare than, say, I don't know, listening to, whatever dance music you like on YouTube. And according to this definition, that those particularly difficult and valuable forms of culture are more valuable than the alternative. And so one way of thinking about this term is that it also sort of necessarily rests upon an antonym, what it sort of contrasts itself against, which is what I would say popular culture. When we talk about popular culture, we mean sort of the culture of the people, the culture that people sort of spontaneously enjoy. So, when someone says, I don't know, go to the symphony or go watch a Shakespeare play because it's good for you, they're talking about culture in this sense. And when they say, I don't know, stop watching YouTube videos or something like that, they're sort of saying stop sort of engaging in popular culture and instead engage in high culture. Again, I am not endorsing these views. I'm simply saying that Williams is saying that these are the meanings that the term has acquired. So what this leaves us then with, according to Williams, is three definitions. Or again, to be more precise, what Williams is saying is that culture, as the term has evolved, at least in English, but also in other languages, has come to kind of coalesce, if you will, to sort of clarify itself around three different meanings or three different terms. On the one hand, this sort of general process of civilization, from savagery to culture, a particular way of life of a people, and intellectual and artistic activity. So where we are for right now is, in other words, that Williams has said the history of the word shows us the shift from the literal meaning to the metaphorical meaning. And once that has happened, that there are these three different definitions. So that's where I'm going to wrap up today. I've been talking for a little over half an hour, so that means you can spend another 15, 20 minutes or so thinking about the questions that I'm about to ask you and that you'll write about in an As You Learn post. And here are the questions that I'd like you to think about. In relation to Williams, does knowing the history of a word, in this case the word culture, help you understand it better? Just think about that for a moment. Does the word help you understand it better? Why or why not? And then secondly, think about one of Williams' three meanings of culture. Okay, remember, and when I say Williams, what I mean, of course, is that Williams has identified. What do you think is gained and what do you think is lost in focusing on this term? I mean, that one particular meaning rather than the other two. So, for example, say that you choose the second meaning, the idea of a distinct way of life. What is the advantage of defining culture in those terms? What do you gain from that? And what do you lose by sort of excluding the other two definitions? Think about those and do a post for that by some point today. And then I will add that you are going to have reading and viewing for tomorrow. For Friday. And there will be an asynchronous lecture connected to that. And I will also send out some questions, and you'll talk together amongst yourselves again via As You Learn. But and those have already been posted, And let me just sort of mention those briefly. There's a video and a reading. Please note that these are going to be particularly, don't want to say particularly difficult, but I think they're somewhat difficult, somewhat challenging, because we're looking at some German philosophers and German philosophical terms, and those are always difficult. There's a short reading by a German philosopher named Cassirer that looks at symbols and argues about the connection between symbols and culture. And then there's a video by a Dutch professor. This is just the best sort of explanation of what I want you to think about that I could find, of a philosophical term called the hermeneutic circle. And so I want you to watch that video and do that reading for Friday, and we will do an asynchronous lecture connected to that. Thank you, everyone. I'm sorry that I can't see you in person, but I look forward to hearing your ideas about all this, and I will see you, of course, in person on Friday. Hope you're having a good day. Hope the beginning of classes has gone well for you. I hope you're safe and healthy, and I will see you soon.